Too bad your baby looks nothing like your husband." My sister-in-law Sophie's joke landed with the grace of a dropped anvil. The warm, cheerful atmosphere of the dining room instantly evaporated, replaced by a sudden, chilling silence. Just moments before, the space had been buzzing with the easy chatter of our family dinner. Now it felt like the Arctic. Every conversation died. Forks hovered, forgotten, on their way to open mouths. Even the old grandfather clock in the hall seemed to have stopped ticking. For an entire week, this dinner had been the singular focus of my existence. 7 straight days of scrubbing floors, polishing silver, and cooking obsessively, all to curate this perfect evening. The beef Wellington had been a day-long project, the pastry latticed with painstaking precision. Our best crystal, the Lalique set we got for our wedding, shimmered under the chandelier's glow. I'd even visited 3 separate florists to find the exact shade of burgundy dahlias for the centerpiece. And why? Because 4 years into my marriage to Mark, I was still auditioning for the role of his wife. Still desperately trying to convince his family that I was more than just the girl their golden boy son had surprisingly chosen, but someone who could add to their spotless family legacy. The bitter irony of it all was thick enough to choke on as I sat there, Sophie's venomous words ringing in my ears. She was perched across the table, her perfectly manicured nails curled around a glass of wine, a self-satisfied smirk dancing on her lips. She looked like she'd just delivered the most brilliant punchline in history. I'd always known Sophie was jealous. As Mark's younger sister, she'd been the undisputed princess of the family until I appeared on the scene, and she'd never forgiven me for siphoning off even a sliver of that attention. But this felt different. This wasn't some petty sibling rivalry. This was a calculated, vicious strike designed to humiliate me in front of everyone I was trying so desperately to win over. I turned to Mark, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I was needing him to rush to my defense, to protect us, to stand up and tell his sister her comment was out of line, disgusting and hurtful, that our son, Leo, was beautiful and perfect and without a single doubt his. But Mark, the man who'd sworn to love and cherish me, what did he do? He laughed. It wasn't a real laugh, but that weak, hollow chuckle he uses when he's pandering to his family, desperate for their approval. His mother, Eleanor, who had always insisted I call her Mom, with a tone that suggested it was a trial basis privilege, actually tittered into her napkin. His father, Richard, usually so stoic and formal, was smirking into his glass of scotch. Even his cousin Laura, who I thought was on my side, hid a smile behind her hand, her eyes shining with that nasty brand of glee people get from watching someone else's public implosion. But it was Isabel's reaction that cut almost as deeply as Mark's betrayal. Our housekeeper, who had been with us since Leo was born, who had seen my tears of exhaustion in those first sleepless months, who knew the depth of my love for my son. Even she was frozen in the kitchen doorway holding the dessert plates, her kind eyes wide with shock and a look that was dangerously close to pity. I could hear Leo's soft, even breaths through the baby monitor on the sideboard. My beautiful, innocent 11-month-old son, sleeping peacefully upstairs, completely unaware that the very adults meant to protect him were downstairs assassinating his mother's character. He had no idea his very existence was being used as a punchline. The worst part, the part that made my stomach clench with a nauseating mix of fury and heartbreak, was that this wasn't the first time. The truth was, Mark had been planting these seeds of doubt since the day Leo was born. He'd been sowing them like a farmer tending a poisonous crop. "His nose is a bit too sharp for a miller, don't you think?" he'd murmured one night, thinking I was asleep, examining our newborn's face as if searching for a clue. "Are you absolutely sure about the dates?" he'd asked me just last month, framing it as a casual question while Leo was playing on the floor. But I saw the gears turning in his head, the way he was mentally counting backward from Leo's due date. I'd seen him staring at our son, not with love, but with a look of detached calculation. During bath time, during feeding time, during those quiet moments when Leo would babble and reach for his father's face, I'd see it, a flicker of what looked like disappointment. Each incident had been a small, private cut, easy enough to ignore, to explain away. I told myself he was just struggling to adapt to fatherhood, that new dads sometimes feel a disconnect. I made excuses for him, the way so many women do when they aren't ready to face the ugly truth about their marriage. But this dinner, this public spectacle in front of the very people whose approval I'd craved for years, this was a line I couldn't unsee, couldn't pretend he hadn't crossed. I let my eyes drift around the table, taking a mental snapshot of each face. Eleanor was still wearing that cold, smug smile she got when she felt she'd won some unspoken competition. Richard had already moved on, reaching for the wine, perfectly at ease with what had just happened. Laura was whispering to her husband, probably crafting the story she'd tell the rest of the family tomorrow. And Mark, my husband, my partner, the father of my child, was studiously avoiding my gaze, suddenly fascinated by the intricate pattern on his plate. The silence stretched out, thick and suffocating. They were all waiting for my reaction. They were expecting tears, I think. Or maybe a dramatic outburst, a flurry of denials. They wanted me to fall apart so they could all shake their heads and murmur about poor Mark and his overly emotional wife. But something inside me didn't break. It hardened. It crystallized into a cold, diamond-hard clarity I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of watching me crumble. I wasn't going to plead for their acceptance or defend myself against an accusation that no decent human being should ever have to face. I was going to do something much, much better. I stood up slowly, my movements measured and deliberate. The scrape of my chair against the polished hardwood floor was the only sound in the room, and it felt deafening. Every eye was on me as I smoothed down my dress and turned towards the hallway, walking with the kind of unnerving calm that comes when you finally know exactly what you need to do. Behind me, I heard the confused murmurs start up. They were probably wondering if I was going to run to the bathroom to cry, or maybe call my mother. They had no idea. They had no idea I was walking toward the one thing that was about to change all of our lives, forever. Tucked away in my jewelry box, hidden beneath the pearls Mark had given me for our second anniversary, was a simple white envelope. I had been holding onto this secret for months, waiting for the perfect moment. And tonight, surrounded by people who thought they knew everything about my life and my child, was the perfect moment. When I returned to that dining room, envelope in hand, I was going to show them exactly what happens when you push a woman who has finally had enough. My fingers found the crisp edge of the envelope, pulling it from its hiding place beneath the pearl necklace. The paper felt strangely heavy, weighted down with 3 months of secrets and the power to detonate the world Mark and his family had so carefully constructed. It was a Tuesday morning in July when I'd finally hit my breaking point. Leo was down for his nap, and I'd found Mark in the living room scrolling blankly through his phone with that detached look he'd been wearing for months. I'd suggested we take a family portrait for Leo's baby book, and he physically recoiled. Maybe later, he'd muttered, his eyes glued to the screen, when his features are more set. As if our son was some unfinished project instead of a perfect, living, breathing child who deserved a father's unconditional love. That afternoon, after Mark had left for one of his late nights at the office, I sat on our bedroom floor, my laptop open, researching DNA laboratories. Not the kind of at-home kits you see advertised on TV. Those felt too informal, too flimsy for something of this magnitude. I needed clinical, undeniable, irrefutable proof. The drive to Veritas Labs took me 45 minutes, far enough from our suburban bubble that the risk of running into someone I knew was practically zero. The building itself was completely anonymous, wedged between a dentist's office and a tax firm in a generic strip mall. Dr. Evans, the geneticist, had kind eyes and a gentle demeanor, but her expression turned serious as I explained my situation. She was a woman in her 50s with streaks of gray at her temples and the patient air of someone who had heard every sad family secret imaginable. "Are you certain you want to do this?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. "These tests have consequences. Sometimes the truth can cause more problems than the uncertainty it solves." I considered her words for a whole 3 seconds before nodding. "I have to know." The process of collecting the samples felt completely surreal, like I was gathering evidence for a crime I hadn't even committed. A few strands of Leo's hair, plucked from his little brush, were so fine they nearly floated away. I wrapped them carefully in a tissue, my hands shaking as I sealed them in the collection vial. Taking Mark's toothbrush was easier to get, but harder to stomach. Standing in our shared bathroom at 5 in the morning, carefully scraping the bristles into a plastic bag, I felt like a spy in my own home. This was what it had come to: covert operations and secret forensics instead of intimacy and trust. The lab's waiting room was empty that day, just me and an anxious-looking older man. I filled out the forms with a steady hand, paid the extra fee for the expedited processing, and was told I'd have the results in 10 days. 10 days. It felt like a lifetime. Every morning, I'd wake up with a jolt, wondering if this was the day. Every evening, my heart would pound as I checked the mail, half hoping and half dreading the sight of the Veritas Labs logo. All the while, Mark's behavior was getting worse. The late nights at work became more frequent. When he was home, he handled Leo with a kind of careful distance, as if our son was a fragile, borrowed object. The playful splashing and silly voices that used to fill our bathroom during bath time were replaced by a cold, mechanical efficiency. The final straw came at a summer barbecue at his brother's house. Mark's nephew, a toddler just a few months older than Leo, ran up to show him a toy car, and the family started cooing about how much the two boys looked alike. It was normal family chatter, the kind of casual comparison that happens at every gathering, but I saw the look on Mark's face, a flash of something dark and suspicious, as if he was analyzing genetic traits instead of just watching two children play. Later, when his sister-in-law commented on how much Leo looked like Mark as a baby, he actually said, "Really? I don't really see it." I had to excuse myself to the bathroom where I cried for 10 straight minutes, gripping the porcelain sink until my knuckles were white. The envelope arrived on a Thursday, tucked between a utility bill and a grocery store flyer, as if it were the most mundane piece of mail in the world. My hands trembled as I tore it open, my eyes scanning past the scientific jargon for the one sentence that would define the rest of my life. Probability of paternity, 99.99%. The wave of relief was so intense, so overwhelming that my legs gave out, and I sank to the kitchen floor. The papers fluttered around me. All those months of whispered doubts, of suspicious glances, of moments where I questioned my own sanity, all of it was washed away by cold, hard, scientific fact. But the relief was quickly replaced by something else, a white-hot, all-consuming fury. Rage at my husband for putting me through this private hell, for making me doubt myself, for treating our beautiful son like a question mark instead of a gift. I sat there for hours, staring at those results, my tears shifting from relief to anger, and finally to a kind of grief. Because even with the proof in my hands, I knew something fundamental between Mark and me had been shattered. The very fact that I needed this test meant our marriage was already broken. The sensible thing to do would have been to confront him right then and there, to march into his study, slam the results on his desk, and demand an apology for months of psychological torment. But a deeper, colder, more calculating part of me took over. I drove back to Veritas Labs and ordered multiple certified copies, printed on heavy official-looking paper stock, each in a sealed envelope with the lab's official stamp. One copy went into our safe deposit box, another was filed away with our most important legal documents. But the third, the one I saved for a special occasion, went into a plain white envelope. I I tucked it into my jewelry box right under the pearls Mark had given me for our anniversary. For weeks, that envelope sat there like a loaded gun. Every time Mark made a snide comment about Leo's features, I'd mentally touch that envelope and feel a surge of power. Every time his family exchanged those knowing glances at a dinner party, I would remind myself that I held the truth while they wallowed in their ugly little fantasies. The hardest part was watching Mark with Leo, seeing the doubt where there should have been nothing but love. Our son would reach up for his father's face with his chubby little hands, babbling with pure joy, completely unaware that the man holding him was questioning his very existence. But I waited, patiently. I waited for the perfect moment to deploy my weapon. And tonight, with Sophie's cruel jab still hanging in the air and Mark's spineless betrayal still fresh, that moment had finally, gloriously arrived. Now, standing in our bedroom with that envelope in my hand, I could feel the weight of it. 3 months of silence were about to shatter into a million pieces. The walk back to the dining room felt like a funeral procession, except I wasn't the one being buried. Each of my footsteps on the hardwood floor was deliberate, a steady rhythm counting down to an explosion. They were all still sitting there, exactly as I had left them, a frozen tableau of awkward guilt and morbid curiosity. Eleanor had her wine glass paused halfway to her lips. Richard was methodically cutting his beef, his eyes fixed on his plate. Laura was whispering urgently to her husband, who just shook his head, desperate to become invisible. And Mark was torturing his napkin, folding and refolding it into a tiny, mangled square. You could feel the nervous energy coming off him in waves. He knew something was wrong, but he had no idea what kind of storm was about to break. When I reappeared in the doorway, the envelope held delicately between my fingers. It felt like the entire room took a single, collective breath and held it. "Since we're all sharing secrets tonight," I said, my voice perfectly calm and clear, "why don't you open this?" I walked over and placed the envelope on the table directly in front of his plate. My fingers brushed against the paper for a fraction of a second, and the contact felt electric. Not with love, but with months of stored-up power and the promise of a reckoning. Mark's smug expression, the one he'd worn so casually just minutes before, began to falter. He glanced up at me, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. This was not the wife he was used to. This wasn't the woman who quietly absorbed his family's insults and his passive-aggressive jabs. This was someone new, someone holding cards he didn't even know were in the deck. "Chloe, what is this?" His voice was thin, cautious, the tone he used when he suspected he was in trouble, but didn't know why yet. I didn't answer. I just stood behind his chair, close enough that he could feel my presence, but positioned so he had to crane his neck to look at me. The power dynamic in the room had completely inverted, and everyone could feel it, even if they didn't understand why. Mark picked up the envelope with a hand that wasn't quite steady. He turned it over, examining the plain white paper as if it might offer a clue. His name, written in my neat cursive, was the only thing on it. "Just open it, Mark," I said softly, but with an edge that made even his mother flinch. He slid a finger under the flap, still trying to project an air of nonchalance. He probably thought it was a bill I wanted him to pay, or a reminder for some appointment. But the exact moment his eyes registered the letterhead at the top of the page, his entire facade crumbled. Veritas DNA Paternity Testing Laboratory, printed in bold official font, and beneath it the words that would become his nightmare: Conclusive Paternity Analysis Results. I watched his face transform. It was like watching a time-lapse video of a building demolition. All the color drained from his cheeks, leaving him a ghastly shade of gray. His mouth fell open, then snapped shut, then opened again, like a fish gasping for air on a pier. He read the first paragraph, then his eyes darted back to the top, rereading it as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. He was frantically searching for a mistake, a loophole, some way for this paper to mean anything other than what it so clearly said. Then, his fingers started to shake. Not just a little tremor, but a violent, uncontrollable trembling, as if he'd been struck by a sudden fever. The paper rustled loudly in his shaking hands, the sound echoing in the dead silence of the room. A lifetime of swagger, of easy confidence, of casual cruelty. It all evaporated in the space of a single heartbeat. This was the man who had privately questioned his son's legitimacy for months, who had publicly thrown me to the wolves for a cheap laugh with his family, and now he couldn't even speak. The silence stretched, becoming thicker and more suffocating with every tick of the grandfather clock, which now seemed to be booming. Through the baby monitor, I could hear Leo's soft, innocent breaths from upstairs, a stark contrast to the implosion of his father's world downstairs. "What is it, Mark?" Sophie's voice, sharp and greedy, sliced through the tension. She was leaning forward, her earlier smugness replaced by a vulture's curiosity. She reached across the table, her fingers like talons trying to snatch the document from her brother's paralyzed grip. I moved faster than she expected. I stepped forward and placed my hand firmly over the paper, covering the results. My palm pressed down on the truth. "Why don't you let your brother explain what he's been accusing me of for the last year?" I said, my voice so dangerously calm that Eleanor let out a small, horrified gasp. The words hung in the air like an indictment. They all understood now. This wasn't just about some piece of paper. This was about months, maybe a year of secret suspicions, of whispered accusations, of the systematic erosion of our marriage. Mark tried to speak. He managed a strangled croak that might have been the start of my name. His Adam's apple bobbed. He tried again. "Chloe, this isn't..." He trailed off, the realization dawning on him that any excuse he could possibly offer would only dig his grave deeper. I just waited. I let him squirm. I let them all watch him fumble for words that didn't exist. Laura cleared her throat. "Maybe we should..." "No," I said. I didn't raise my voice, but the single word was a steel door slamming shut. "We shouldn't do anything. Mark should explain to all of you why he felt the need to question his own son's paternity." "Oh, but he didn't do it, did he? He just planted the seeds of doubt. He just made me feel like a criminal in my own house." Richard put down his fork and knife, the clatter of silver on china sounding sharp and final. "Mark, what in God's name is she talking about?" But Mark was mute. The man who was always so quick with a joke or a cutting remark was utterly broken, staring at the proof of his own pathetic shame as his entire family watched him disintegrate. I lifted my hand from the document, allowing the official letterhead of Veritas Labs to be seen by all. I didn't need to say another word. Then I walked over to the high chair where my beautiful son had been sitting before dinner, picked up his favorite stuffed giraffe from the floor, and held it tight. The soft toy smelled like him, like baby powder and pure, uncomplicated love. It was a reminder of what was real in a room suddenly choked with lies and regret. When I turned back to face them, the silence was my closing argument, because sometimes the truth doesn't need to be shouted. It just needs to be revealed. The silence finally shattered when Mark found what was left of his voice. It was a weak, unrecognizable rasp. "Chloe, honey, it was just..." He tripped over the words, his face a frantic slideshow of panic, shame, and a desperate search for an escape route. "You have to understand, it was just locker room talk, family banter. We were all just joking." I clutched the stuffed giraffe, its soft fabric a small comfort against my chest. Leo was sleeping soundly upstairs, blissfully unaware that his very identity had just been scientifically validated for a room full of people who should have never doubted it in the first place. "Jokes," I repeated, the word tasting like poison in my mouth. "Is that what you call it? Spending months insinuating your own son isn't yours. Is that a joke, Mark?" The temperature in the room plunged. Eleanor's hand was trembling so hard her wine sloshed over the rim of her glass. I watched Richard's jaw clench, the muscles working as the full weight of my revelation settled upon him. Mark's hands were still shaking as he looked down at the DNA results on the table. He couldn't seem to look away from them, as if he could somehow unread the words. You don't get it. The pressure. People make comments. They say he looks different, and I just... What people? I cut him off, my voice like a shard of glass. Your sister? Your parents? The same people who just sat here and laughed while you humiliated me in my own home? Sophie, who had been strangely silent since her failed attempt to grab the results, finally piped up. We were just teasing you, Chloe. God, you're always so dramatic. But her bravado was gone. It was a weak, defensive jab, and everyone in the room could hear the desperation in her voice. Teasing me, I said, and a laugh escaped my lips, but it was cold and humorless. You made a joke about my son's legitimacy in front of his entire family, and when my husband, the one person who should have defended us, decided to join in, you all laughed. That's your idea of a good time? Leo chose that exact moment to stir upstairs, a soft coo coming through the baby monitor. The sound was so innocent, so pure, it made the adult's behavior seem all the more monstrous. My composure was clearly unnerving them, far more than any screaming match could have. I could see them exchanging furtive glances, waiting for me to finally break, to have the hysterical meltdown that would allow them to dismiss me as unstable. But I just stood there, holding that giraffe, letting the truth do all the work. It was Richard who broke first. Mark's father, a man I'd never heard admit fault in his life, looked me straight in the eye with something that resembled respect. I owe you an apology, Chloe, he said, his voice gruff but sincere. What happened here tonight was inexcusable. You deserved better from all of us, and especially from my son. The words landed like a shockwave. Eleanor's hand flew to her throat, and real tears welled in her eyes. Not the crocodile tears she used to garner sympathy, but genuine tears of shame. Oh, my dear, she whispered, her hand reaching across the table toward me. I am so sorry. We never should have... Mark never told us he was having these doubts. We never should have participated in that. Even Laura, who had been giggling just minutes ago, looked utterly mortified. She stared at her plate, wishing the floor would swallow her whole. I think we should probably get a ride home, she mumbled to her husband, who nodded so fast he nearly gave himself whiplash. But it was Sophie's reaction that was the most telling. The architect of this entire disaster was now staring at me with a look of dawning horror, mixed with something that looked a lot like fear. You planned this, she accused, her voice high and shrill. You knew what you were doing. You had that envelope ready. I shifted my weight and allowed myself a small, tight smile. You're right, Sophie. I did. Just like you planned that little joke of yours. The only difference is, my plan was based on the truth. Sophie's face went from red to white and back again. She shoved her chair back from the table with a screech of wood on wood. This is insane. I'm not going to sit here and be attacked. She snatched her purse, but not before I saw the flash of deep, burning humiliation in her eyes. No one's making you stay, I said calmly. But before you go, you might want to ask yourself why you felt the need to say that in the first place. Was it really about Leo? Or was it about me? She froze by the door, and for a split second, I thought she might actually consider the question. But self-reflection was not Sophie's strong suit. You're impossible, she spat before turning and storming out. The slam of the front door echoed through the silent house. The tension that remained was different. It was heavier, weighted down by the ugly reality of what had just been exposed. Mark cleared his throat. Chloe, maybe we could talk about this in private. Work through... No, I said, the word coming out like a stone. Secrets deserve an audience, Mark, just like your joke did. He flinched as if I'd struck him. "You wanted to air your doubts in front of your family," I continued, my voice unwavering. "You wanted to make me the punchline in front of the very people whose respect I've spent 4 years trying to earn. So now, we deal with the consequences the same way, in public." The power in that room had shifted so completely, it was a tangible thing. These people who had been laughing at me, dismissing me, treating me like an outsider, were now looking at me with something that felt, for the first time, like genuine respect. And for the first time since I'd married into this family, I didn't hate the woman they saw. The rest of the evening was a blur of strained civility. Richard and Eleanor made stilted small talk about the stock market, while Laura and her husband made a hasty exit. Isabel cleared the plates of barely eaten food with a quiet dignity that spoke volumes. The real confrontation, however, began later that night, after the last guest had departed and Leo was sleeping soundly in his crib. I stood in our bedroom, staring at the small suitcase I'd placed on the bed. It wasn't large, just an overnight bag, but seeing it open and waiting felt like a monumental act. Mark appeared in the doorway, a ghost of the man he'd been that morning. He watched me fold a sweater with methodical precision. "What are you doing?" His voice was a bare whisper, as if a normal tone might shatter what was left of our life. "Packing," I said, not looking up. "Chloe, please," he begged, taking a step into the room. "I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. But leaving isn't the answer." I finally turned to face him, and I was struck by how small and deflated he looked. The confident, charming man I married had been replaced by a frightened boy caught in a lie he couldn't talk his way out of. "I'm not leaving for good," I said, and watched a flicker of relief cross his face. "But I'm showing you that I can. The woman you married, the one who would have cried herself to sleep tonight and then pretended it never happened. She's gone, Mark." The truth of it settled between us. Something fundamental had broken in that dining room, and we both knew there was no going back. "Tell me what to do," he pleaded, desperation raw in his voice. "Tell me how to fix this." I closed the suitcase and sat on the edge of the bed. Marriage counseling, real counseling, not just a few sessions to check a box. Full financial transparency. I want access to and a say in every account, every investment, and a public apology to everyone who was at that dinner. He nodded frantically, agreeing before I'd even finished. "Yes, of course. Anything." "Chloe, I'm so sorry." But his immediate agreement didn't reassure me. It felt like damage control, not genuine remorse. "You agreed to that very quickly," I observed, picking up the suitcase. "Almost like you're not really thinking about what it means." "I am," he protested, his eyes fixed on the bag in my hand. "I just want us to be okay again. We're not going to be okay again, Mark. Not in the way we were." I walked towards the door, and he moved aside. "We might become something new. But the marriage, where I tiptoed around your family and swallowed your suspicions to keep the peace, that marriage is over." I spent the next 3 days at my sister's house. The physical distance gave me something I hadn't realized I was missing: clarity. Mark called. He sent flowers. He left pleading voicemails. But I was listening with new ears. When I returned home, I was different. The first thing I did was change the password on our joint bank account. Then I called our financial advisor and requested copies of all our statements. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Miller?" he asked, audibly confused by my sudden interest in finances I'd always left to Mark. "Everything is perfect," I said. "I'm just taking a more active role." And what I found was illuminating. Mark hadn't been reckless, but he had been making major decisions unilaterally, opening a separate retirement fund, making high-risk investments, all without a single conversation with me. It painted a picture of a man who saw me not as a partner, but as a passenger. The most damning discovery came while I was organizing our files. Tucked away in a folder labeled MISC, I found 3 printed quotes for paternity testing services, all dated from 2 months after Leo was born. He had been looking into it almost from the beginning. I sat in our home office staring at those papers and felt the last piece of the old me fall away. The woman who had trusted blindly was gone. In her place was someone harder, more cynical, but also more honest with herself. If Mark could question something as fundamental as our son, then I needed to question everything else. That night, when Mark found me sorting through bank statements, he tried to joke. "Spring cleaning a little early?" I looked up at him, and I saw him clearly for the first time. Not as my partner, but as someone I needed to protect myself and our son from. The realization was both heartbreaking and liberating. "Something like that," I said, filing the papers away, just making sure I understand our complete financial picture. For the first time in our marriage, I was preparing for a future that might not include him, and the thought didn't terrify me. It felt like freedom. 2 months later, Leo's first birthday party felt like a final exam. The house was a sea of cheerful balloons and streamers, but beneath the festive surface, the tension was palpable. I had planned every detail not out of a need for perfection this time, but out of a fierce determination to make the day about my son, not the family drama. The guest list was a mix of friends, neighbors, and the extended family who had all heard the story of the dinner. They all knew. Eleanor and Richard arrived early bearing a massive gift and strained smiles. "Chloe, darling, it all looks wonderful," Eleanor said, her kiss on my cheek feeling rehearsed. Richard shook Mark's hand with a formal stiffness that spoke volumes, but I saw the way his eyes kept drifting to Leo's face, as if seeing his grandson for the very first time. My sister, Jen, helped me with the food. "Is she coming?" she whispered, not needing to say the name. I shook my head. Sophie sent her regrets. That was a polite way of putting it. Sophie had sent a curt text. "Can't make it. Hope Leo has a nice day." Her absence was, frankly, a relief. As guests mingled in the backyard, I watched Mark work the crowd. He was a bundle of nervous energy, constantly glancing at me, then at his watch, as if waiting for a cue. The moment came after we sang Happy Birthday and Leo had joyfully smeared cake all over his face. As the laughter and camera flashes subsided, Mark stood up and cleared his throat. "I'd like to say something," he announced. The yard fell quiet. My stomach tightened. We had rehearsed this in therapy, but the reality of it was intensely uncomfortable. "First, thank you all for being here to celebrate our son," he began, his voice surprisingly steady. "Seeing him surrounded by so much love means the world to us." He paused, swallowing hard. "This was it. But I also need to address something that some of you may have heard about," he continued. "You could feel the energy shift across the lawn. A few months ago, I made some comments and harbored some doubts about my son's parentage that were baseless and incredibly cruel to my wife." His voice cracked on the word cruel. "I questioned something that should never have been in question, and I allowed others to do the same. Chloe had to get a paternity test to prove what she should never have had to prove, that Leo is my son, 99.99%, beyond any doubt." He turned and looked directly at me, and for the first time I saw pure, unadulterated remorse in his eyes. "I'm so sorry, Chloe. I'm sorry for doubting you, for hurting you, and for making you defend yourself from my own insecurity." I held his gaze, my expression unreadable. I felt a complex mix of emotions, satisfaction at his public humiliation, but also a deep sadness that our marriage had come to this. Sad that my son's first birthday would be forever marked by his father's public penance. Sad that proof of love now required lab reports and formal apologies. The applause that followed was polite, but subdued. As the party slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy, I found myself standing by the dessert table. "That must have been difficult for you both," a voice said. It was Dr. Evans, our marriage counselor, whom I'd invited on a whim. "More than I expected," I admitted. "I thought it would feel like a victory, but mostly it just feels sad, a necessary step, but not a final destination," she suggested gently. She was right. The apology was a requirement, but it couldn't magically erase the damage or rebuild the trust he had shattered. In the weeks that followed, Sophie's absence from family functions became a new and surprisingly pleasant normal. Without her constant stream of toxic commentary, dinners with my in-laws were almost enjoyable. They were trying, in their own clumsy way, to make amends. But the biggest change wasn't in them. It was in me. I had stopped seeking validation. I stopped shrinking myself to fit into a family that had never made room for me. The woman who had desperately wanted Eleanor to call her daughter was gone, replaced by someone who understood that respect was more valuable than affection, and that boundaries were more important than belonging. My son would grow up seeing a mother who fought for her own worth. He would learn that love without respect is an empty gesture, and that sometimes the most powerful act of love is refusing to accept anything less than you deserve. That envelope hadn't just held DNA results. It had held my own liberation. It was the proof that I was done asking for a seat at the table. From now on, I would be building my own. If this story of ultimate vindication had you on the edge of your seat, go ahead and hit that like button. My favorite part was when Chloe walked back into that dining room, knowing she held all the power in that one little envelope. What was your favorite moment? Let me know in the comments below. And if you don't want to miss more incredible stories of women who refuse to be silenced, make sure you subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss an upload. End of story.